And we'll be recording this session, so I hope that's okay with everyone. And so that we'll be putting it up on YouTube for others to see at, in the future. So I'm very excited as well because as your student rep, I'm also very excited to also introduce our new student council member, Laya Ziai Bigdeli, who is also pursuing a doctorate at Irvine in the University of California. She's here today. This is her first AIS presidential session, so it's great to have her on board. I also would like to have say a big thank you to Fahid Mazde, who provided a lot of support during this during the preparations for this session. So today we'll be looking at fellowships and grants and how we navigate this very complicated process. And we've got a great lineup for you, including our president, Dr. Naghmeh Sohrabi, who is the Charles Goodman Professor of Middle East History at Brandeis University. We've got our other council member, Dr. Hosna Sheikholeslam, who is an assistant professor of anthropology and sociology at Denison University. And finally, we have Dr. Stella Morgana, who is a lecturer of Middle East politics at the University of Amsterdam. So on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, we'll be getting a lot of insight from them. Before we start the session, I'd just like to gently remind everyone, our audience specifically, to keep your speakers on mute and to please switch off your videos and to type your questions in the chat box. We'll get to them when we have our Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, we'll like to start our session, and I'd like to invite firstly Professor Sohrabi to introduce to us this very, very big topic and to share some insights as well. So I'll hand over to you, Dr. Sohrabi.
Great. So greetings, everyone. I want to first begin by thanking Rowena and Laya for putting together this very timely, very important panel. I have to say, when we started the presidential sessions about a year and a half ago, I had no idea it would grow this big. There are a lot of participants in this session, and we have such great audience and such great panelists, and I'm very excited. And I will just say that not just this one, but all our previous presidential sessions, all of which are focusing on professionalization and what you need to do as a young scholar and as a graduate student, are available on the AIS website. And I encourage you all to use this really important resource. So as, and again, I'm really excited to be here. So as Rowena and Laya's basically message to me was that I need to give you a broader sense of the landscape, but also sort of talk to you about what to do for fellowships, what is needed, do's and don'ts in some ways. And so in terms of the broader landscape, just like the idea of what fellowships are available, what to apply for, we've put together, Vahid in particular has put together a list, and everybody on the panel have added names of places to it. So I'm actually not going to go through that. You'll be able to see it by the end of this session. We're going to drop the link into the chat box, and then the link is going to be available also with on the YouTube site and also on our website. So take notes, but you don't have to worry about all the names that people are going to be dropping of places to apply for. Anyway, there are more learned people on this panel like Hosna and Stella who are going to give you a very more specific idea of the landscape. I thought I would sort of use my time to talk about what makes a successful fellowship and grant application, and also what you should apply for, what you shouldn't apply for. So let me start with the easiest one about what you should apply for. You should apply for everything. But you also should not apply for things you are not qualified for. Now, what do I mean by this seemingly contradictory thing? You should apply for everything that relates to your work, whether it's in Iranian studies, whether it's in Middle Eastern studies, whether it's in your discipline. My father always said, and he still says that, let other people reject you. You don't need to do the rejecting yourself. You have a lot of work to do, take that off your plate, right? So apply for everything, even if you have, as all of us, including myself, have, what's the word, imposter syndrome. We think there are other people, there are better people. I don't come from this school, I don't come from that school, I haven't done, can I ask everyone to shut down their microphones? That'd be great, thanks. Apply for everything. But at the same time, when I say don't apply for things you're not qualified for, I mean, do not apply for things that are not in your field or are not asking, they're asking for something else that does not apply to you. What I mean is that I get, for example, at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies, we get a lot of applications where a place that does contemporary modern Middle East, we get a lot of applications in medieval studies. Don't apply for those things. And not applying for those things is related to what I'm going to go through in terms of what fellowships and grants are looking for, right? But everything in your field, all of it, be ambitious, put in the time and apply. It does not hurt you. And as I'm going to repeat over and over again in my talk, in my opening remarks today, you know, a rejection from a fellowship or a grant or anything really is not a rejection of you. It's just a question of there not being a good fit. A fit, it involves two groups. It does not involve one person. So it's not about you. But if you think you have a chance, no matter how you feel about your own work and the imposter syndrome, apply widely, apply for a lot. Something will happen. Now, in terms of what fellowships and grants are looking for, I'm going to talk about 3 broad issues, and then I'm happy to answer more questions in the Q&A. The first thing, the most important thing is your application needs to be clear and it needs to be devoid of discipline-specific language, in other words, jargon, right? The way I tell our postdocs at the Crown Center is, can you summarize your project to me in 2 minutes, all of it? If you can do that, then you have a really good grasp of what you're doing, and that should be your opening statement of every grant application, right? Those of us who read grant applications, people who read fellowship applications, have a lot to read, right? We don't have time to get to the point. So if you're applying for a fellowship or a grant, the first thing you want to do is, in the opening paragraph, have 2 sentences that says, I am applying to do X, and that X needs to be devoid of any jargon, any discipline-specific language. The thing to remember about any kind of application that you're applying for, jobs are a little different than fellowships, that these are documents of persuasion. You are persuading someone to give you X amount of money and support your work. You need to persuade them. And the fact that they don't know you, the fact that they may not be in your discipline, they may not be in Iranian studies, they may be in Iranian studies, but don't know the kind of work that you do, makes it very important that you put it in a language as if you're explaining it to your parents who may not be academics, or your aunts and uncles, or a friend of yours who's in the tech, right? Somebody who is not in the field needs to understand that. And that's the most important thing that you can do when you're writing a fellowship. The second, as important, it's not secondly important, it's as important, is that you have to show the relevance saying this from personal experience, my own self, it took me a long time to get here. We, especially in the humanities, social sciences still, but a little less. Somebody said, I think that takes away from the larger quest for knowledge that we're doing. Do your larger quest for knowledge, but remember that a fellowship application is a very specific thing. It's persuading someone to part from their money and support your work. And part of that is being able to answer the so what question. And the fact is, it's a good thing to know, and it's a good exercise to have. And I promise you, every single person who is in the humanities and social sciences and is working on a project, be it ancient Iranian studies, be it medieval studies, all the way to contemporary Iran, you do, if you look for it, there is going to be an answer to the so what question. It's just a matter of finding it. And finding it may be difficult and may require a lot of thinking to do, but the applications that are the most successful applications do the work for the person reading it and answering all the questions that they're going to have. One of which is, why should I fund this? Why should I give the money to this person? And if you can do the work for them, if you can say, A, here's my project, you can easily understand it in 2 seconds. You don't need to have a PhD in my field to understand what my project is. And B, this is important because, and find something relevant to say. And you will find that, I have zero doubt about it. That automatically transcends your application from a so-so application to a contender. The third tip I would give you is to read is funding the way it is very carefully and mimic that language, but not in a parroting kind of way of the application of the fellowship. Understand what they are looking for, and in it address that. Again, you want to answer the questions without being there, because the only thing you have is your fellowship application to answer their questions. So let's suppose you're applying for something humanities. Make sure your application says, my work intersects with public humanities in the most important keywords in the fellowship application that you have, and use that as a way of persuading the fellowship committee. I think that's the gist of what I wanted to say. The last thing I'll say, and I said this at the top of my early comments, was that don't forget, A, you get rejected, so what? We've all gotten rejected. In fact, I have a nice little box of all of my rejection letters. I love it. I take them out once in a while and look at them. And I'm of a generation in which our rejection letters did not come in emails, but in actual physical letters. And I have a lot of them. And every rejection actually helped me become a better grant writer. And I will say I'm a really good grant writer right now. And I give credit to all the times that I didn't get something. And what you do with that rejection is you don't say, well, I got rejected because I didn't go to this school, or I got rejected because I didn't go to that school, or whatever, or there's a conspiracy against me. You take the rejection letter, you go and you talk to someone who may have gotten it. You ask to read their application. Some fellowship organizations are willing to talk to you about your applications. They're very few because everybody is just so incredibly overwhelmed with a lot of paperwork. But find out, and do this also actually before you write your fellowship letter, but find out who've gotten it, talk to them, see what they included in their fellowship application that you did not include it, and use that knowledge to tweak it for the next application that you're writing. And it will eventually happen. You know, there's a lot of money out there and you can get it, but it's just a question of, are you writing a persuasive document to make people part with their money or not?
Thank you so much. I know that for sure I'm going to take that to consideration next time. Well, in the fall that I write for the applications for next year. Now we would like to turn to our second speaker, Dr. Sheikholeslam. I was wondering if you can speak about fellowship and grants in North America, as well as foundation institutions that sort of provide those kind of fundings.
Sure. Thank you to you and Rowena for arranging this, and for Naghmeh for heading this presidential session, and her very, very useful comments, which I would absolutely like second and third and all of that. So I will actually, like Naghmeh, I won't be talking about the foundations because that's just a list, and we're going to share that with you. But I thought what would actually be more useful is thinking about giving you guys a little bit of the layout of the types of funding that are out there. And I'm going to be talking about some of them more than others, and then sharing some strategies for applying, but not in terms of what goes into your application. So I think these two comments should work together nicely. So first of all, right, it's really important to recognize that there's different kinds of funding that come into play at different stages. So there's funding that you could use for your graduate education, and some funders will say we will only pay your financial institution. So they're not necessarily for your research project, right? They're helping you during the educational process. There's sort of fellowships or scholarships or grants that come to help you do your research, right? Regardless of whether you're doing like field research or archival research or just, like reading documents. And then there's also postdocs, and postdocs are confusing because there's some postdoctoral fellowships or pre-doctoral fellowships that are intended to help you write and finish your dissertation. And then there's obviously the ones that are like positions with academic institutions. So we're not going to consider the latter because sometimes they're all grouped together, but they're quite different, and the application process is different insofar that, like, for the latter, you usually have to apply like you would, right? You have to interview like you would an academic job. But for most writing pre-doctoral fellowships or postdoctoral fellowships, it's just a normal application process like it is with another fellowship or grant. So with that breakdown, right, one of the strategies that I found really useful and that I encourage you all to take seriously is mapping out your future trajectory of when you plan to apply. Is that many of these fellowships, at least the ones I've applied for, allow reapplications. And they have a large breadth of when you could start to use it. So let's say you want to do a year's worth more of classwork, and then you want to spend a year doing research, right? It's almost like you have two opportunities to get certain forms of funding. And so having for yourself like a bird's eye view of what you qualify for when will help both increase your chances of applying for them, right? Not missing the deadline, and in certain cases, of potentially reapplying. And some funders are very amenable to reapplications, right? They're more likely to fund a project the second time around, assuming, right, there's considerable improvement in the application. So give yourself a map. And the way you come up with the map is obviously we'll be sharing sources for you. I think that made a good point. Never limit yourself to just stuff on Iran. And then also, there's two other things I do, which is ask around in your older people in your cohort, right? When you're in a PhD program, or your professors, but also troll people's CVs and see, look at scholars you respect and see what grants they got and write them down. This is what I would do if I read something oh, they got this, I will apply to this when I'm at this stage in my career. And so then, right, you're building your list of what your ideal form of scholarship and scholarship also looks like. So unconventional, but there's do's and don'ts of an application. Naghmeh's comments were great. I'll also in the chat put a link from the Social Science Research Council that is really useful. But I think for me, the examples, I cannot emphasize this enough. Grant writing is a very specific genre. It's very intellectual, but it's also formulaic, and some people really thrive like me. I love it. It's so it forces you to put your thoughts in a certain form, but it can be learned, and it can only be learned by looking at lots and lots of winning examples. So how do you get them, right? This is a question I always had as someone who's a terrible networker. You just have to ask. You can ask your classmates, you can ask older people in your cohort, you can ask your professors. Also, many times there are examples of successful grants on different university websites, especially if you think of the top R1 universities like UC Berkeley, Davis, Michigan. A lot of these big public schools with funding for support for graduate students will have examples of winning grants, including the ones you might be interested in, on their websites. I found a few good models for my own work that way. So ask around, but also they may be publicly available. You just have to search for them, right, in unconventional ways. So I think, yeah, sort of keeping a running list, looking at examples, and then also, right, there are also something to pay attention to is there are both internal and external grants. And internal means ones that are internal to your institution. And obviously some institutions have more funding. Some, thinking UCLA, Arizona, Princeton have particular pools of funding for students who are doing work in Iranian studies at those institutions. But regardless, most institutions offer some form of internal funding for any of the stages I've talked about, right? Whether it's sort of coursework stage, at the research stage, or at the writing stage. And you should always apply for those internal applications, right? Many public universities have internal competitions for dissertation write-up, sort of like a year to fund that. And so that's also, it's low-hanging fruit in that it's within your institution. So there's much less competition than national grants, and you should definitely go for it. Also, one of the other things in terms of process, so looking at winning examples, but also starting early and getting lots of feedback. I don't think I've ever had anything I've written looked at by more people than my initial fellowship application for field research. I think I started in September and it was due in the winter. So like it was a good few months. And I've never had any eyes, even to this day, I don't think as many people have even looked at my dissertation as they did that document. And I asked friends, I asked anyone I'd taken coursework with, honestly, because the reality is the people who will be reading your application will be coming at it from really far out of your field. So you can only benefit by having sort of unfamiliar eyes look at it. And everyone will give you sort of feedback that's really useful. And so taking time to sort of polish it, and yeah, lots and lots of feedback. And I think this is especially true with certain grants. So for instance, if you are a US national and at a US university, and this is something I want to mention in closing briefly, you can apply for an NSF, for instance, to do fieldwork in Iran and other places. But NSF, the readers at NSF tend to appreciate, I would say, more sciencey language than we tend to produce in the humanities and social sciences. And so again, looking at examples and having people who won those grants look it over is very useful, right? Because like, for instance, like this is, I think it's my NSF grant application was the first and last time I ever had to talk about a null hypothesis, but it's right. It's something that sort of readers of that genre. Yeah, I think that's sort of my big takeaway hits in terms of process, right? How to set up a process where you're like keeping abreast, where to find grants, Iranian stuff. But another really good resource again is other universities sort of grant you. And then closing, I just want to say, I think this is a really difficult time for funding. Just in the last month, two sort of major and like longstanding funders of work in those social sciences and humanities cut their programs. So the SSRC used to have an incredible IDRF program that was for international dissertation research. And the nice thing about it was that you could apply as a foreign national, right? You didn't have to be a UN citizen. They just ended their program. So I don't know of any programs, unfortunately, that fund international students in the US for international work abroad. Any national funders. Your university may, and that's different. And also the Mellon ACLS, which again has been a long-standing sort of funder of the writing phase, also just announced they're ending their program. So I think right, those institutions, right? Like I think there's also like work that we can do to, you know, to show that this work is still important, that it hasn't run its course. I do think it's also, yeah, more constraints. I'm sorry, I ended on a down note. I apologize.
No worries. I mean, it's
that
important.
was great.
Yeah. No, sorry. Thank you, Hosna, for going through all of that and for sharing or what you've been through. I think it's important to be realistic and to know the situation that we're in. In our last presidential session, we looked at the job market after the pandemic, and it is generally just a very difficult market right now. And it's good to bear that in mind as well. So thank you so much, Hosna. And perhaps now we could move on to Dr. Morgana, and who can maybe take us through the other side of the Atlantic and what the situation is like in Europe, and maybe you can share some of the experiences. That would be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. First of all, let me use my time to thank Rowena and Laya and our AIS President Dr. Professor Naghmeh Sohrabi to organizing this stellar panel and session, and also to inviting me here. I think that I would love to start with the really $1 million question. Are there Iranian studies focused fellowships and grants in Europe? Well, actually, I'm sorry to say, not really. It is so difficult, and we all know that, right? To find specific fellowships tailored to Iranian studies. And I know that, I mean, as my passions have been like and my research has been all on Iran lately. But I have good news for all of you, and let me use my time now to go straight to the point and to say that my why here, I mean, my contribution is my why. So I would love to tell you and that there are fellowships, and while selecting these 3 fellowships and these programs I'm going to talk about today in Europe, I actually thought of all the Iranians who live in Iran, who are all the time very worried. And most of you, I know that you are here in our panel. So I thought of you because while I was selecting these 3 fellowships, because I thought, well, it's so easy for me. I mean, I'm a white woman and I'm European. I hold the right passport to go almost anywhere. So I understand your position, and that's why I'm going to list for you and to go through. Maybe it's going to be useful. Also, feel free to ask questions on that. I'm going to go through 3 different fellowships. The first one is in Amsterdam, so the Netherlands, and it is at the International Institute for Social History. And please take notes because the deadline is approaching. It's on the 8th of May. So very close. But there's a good news because these fellowships are awarded for 6 months. So starting on the 1st of October 2022. But this call for application requires just an MA degree or higher, meaning that if you wish to use, for example, the collections of the Dr. Sabah Farmayan at the International Institute for Social History, and you want to study social history and in particular the social and economic history of the 18th and 20th century Iran, that's the fellowship that might be right for you. You just need to, I mean, an MA degree for that, meaning that I know that a lot of people here are still doing their PhD, or they want to start breaking through this, the bastion of Europe, because it's quite difficult to get through the whole visa process. And I started by selecting this really tiny grant because the fellowship, which will give you a monthly I think 1,500 euros, also includes the economic return flight to the Netherlands, but most importantly, it to help some of the scholars coming to for short fellowships and visiting opportunities to Amsterdam and my university, and it is very difficult, I know. So you have my solidarity and my support. I will post this link in the final Google Doc that we but I want also use my time to I think might be alright, because the deadline is long, and I'm talking about these in this in one of the 3 main that are requested. So I would advise, which is quite easy. Also, I selected this because one CV, but I think again, and a really good point that made me select this fellowship and universities. Two recommendations at this stage are required. And to go through the whole application. So the deadline will be in fall 2022, and the call for application will open in spring 2022. So this is not, we can expect it to be open by the end of May, I would say. So for the Iranians who are in Iran and love to start apply for that, please feel free to email me, because I know that the process cannot be a great opportunity, also because for a great opportunity to develop great researchers based in Iran who are just willing to break the big wall of Europe. I think I can stop here because I would love to give you the chance to ask for more questions, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morgana. This was really interesting and amazing, and I think a lot of Iranian scholars would appreciate it. I always wanted to have this dialogue with Iranian scholars and have them also included, which is fantastic. So I'm going to start us off in the chat. It's a question to all of you, our panelists, is that how do you think the pandemic has really affected these fellowships? I mean, I know Hosna, which I was, to my surprise, you said IDRF. I was like applying for the past 2 years and looking forward to applying for this year, and I'm like shocked. So
I can start off. I mean, I think a different take on this than Hosna does, and we're all speculating, so it could be, I think what's happening in the US, if you look at, for example, the Iran-based fellowships, all of them are still there. A lot of the Middle East-based fellowships, they're all still there. What happened with Mellon, the pandemic did affect it, but they ended up redirecting money to other categories of people that they thought had been more affected by the pandemic. So in this sense, Hosna is correct, but the money did not stop. The money was redirected and repurposed for a different thing, rid of its fellowship. And everything that is happening on the US landscape, which is not necessarily pandemic related, but it coincided with it, is that there was an outburst of fellowships, for example, that thematically were interested in issues of social justice, on racial inequality, all the things that came out of the conversations that were happening, excuse me, in the US 2 years ago. So again, a lot of funders or a lot of fellowships that may have been general or may have had other topics redirected themselves towards issues of social US based, and this is where I'm going to go back to my comments, are seemingly US based. And you can say, well, I don't work on it. And maybe you don't. Like if you don't do anything that is related to social justice, then you don't. You go look for something else. But at the same time, I think sometimes the issue with us in Iranian studies is that we are too insecure to make claims to larger issues. And this redirection of money may also force us to say, okay, in what ways are we part of this larger conversation that is happening? In what ways does my work, right? My work, for example, on the Iranian Revolution, how does it intersect with conversations in the United States on questions of social justice? So it has affected the landscape in some ways, either by taking away fellowships or redirecting them towards other topics. But that doesn't mean that it has foreclosed itself to Iranian studies. It has meant, though, that we need to stop being so provincial in our thinking, for lack of a better word, and actually think about the ways in which we are engaging in global topics. And it's hard, it's very hard, but it is possible to be part of that conversation.
That's great advice. Yeah. I often feel that we're like a niche discipline, but in reality, we have we can be broader. Our other speakers, do you have anything to sort of add on to that?
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that the money was gone. It's just that for these sort of general historic things that have like so many of us who work in Iranian studies have actually had our work funded by IDRF. So it is a loss. My work really doesn't work with race, so it is a stretch for me. But I think I actually had it in my notes, Naghmeh, similar to what you said, is like, take a look at these big funders and look at the calls that are open and see how if you're in the process of developing your project, maybe it pushes you in a certain direction. If you've already developed your project, you can still think about like, how am I, so I missed it, but that was in my notes too. And so take inspiration, right? Like the SSRC does fund all of these different topical issues now. And your work might very well be a good fit for those.
Thank you so much. Dr. Morgana, do you have anything to add on to that? No? Okay. So we have two questions. One is there any kind of research trend in the Iranian studies that can put our grant application at an advantage? And so they say, for instance, is a grant with a topic on intellectual history still interesting for the funding agent?
Do you mind if I'll jump in real quick and then I'll pass it on. So I think it's tricky, right? Like, because we just told you like there's funding being directed towards topics, and I think that may be true. That being said, I think so much of selling seemingly obscure topics has to do with the quality of the writing of the actual application. And this is what Naghmeh spoke to, right? Like really figuring out what the stakes are. I have seen the most like on surface, like obscure, I'm an anthropologist. So most of us work in really like obscure, tiny things. And yet, right, part of it is like, what is this contributing to sort of knowledge and intellectual discourse and like concerns that, you know, other academics, this doesn't mean you have to ride any given intellectual wave, but it's to say like learning to make your project speak to larger issues is, I think, the challenge of the grant. And it's why it's such an incredible intellectual exercise too, right? It forces you to figure out like, who am I talking to and with? And why does this matter? Like, why should someone actually give me money to do this? But I don't think like obscurity or specificity of topic is by any means a limiting factor.
Great point.
Yeah, I would actually totally agree with what just Hosna said, because I think that intellectual history is still, for example, in the Netherlands or in Germany, all these little grants are actually granted and fellowships are tailored and given to topics focusing on intellectual history, for example, or social history. I think it's a matter of why we write a specific project and how we connect that why to our how. So I would say that.
I would only add, I agree with everything that Hosna and Stella said, with the caveat that I'll just be very blunt. You know, if you're doing intellectual history of great men, you're probably not going to get funding. That moment has passed. I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think you can still do intellectual history. Great men can be in it, but you can actually build a wider canvas. So in terms of the things that probably it's harder to get funding for right now, those kinds of topics that maybe in the 60s or in the 50s were considered to be hot topics, no longer really sell. But intellectual history as is being done today, and that's another thing that actually fits into exactly what Stella said, absolutely, like, people are doing intellectual history, they are being innovative and interesting about it, and that absolutely will, if you can formulate it the way Hosna and Stella talked about, then you absolutely fit in. The problem is if it's like, I'm doing intellectual history, name a person, name a man who 5 books have been written, and I'm going to write do another project on that person, you're not going to get funding for that.
Okay, our next question is regarding the use of simple language. What about those theoretical concepts that are critical to your, one's research and are necessary, but it's not really known by other scholars in the field? I guess the question is like, how do you formulate that? Do you not include them, or you include them in a way that is more comprehensible to other people?
I think the latter, right? I think there is plenty of, okay, this is like the trickiest thing. There is plenty of room in a grant to explain the theoretical concepts that are central to your project. However, by plenty of room, I mean, like, you have very little word count. And so the challenge of writing these grants, and the reason I said, like, start early, have people read it, is like, it takes time to boil down complex concepts into like 2 or 3 sentences, which is sometimes more than you'll have at points in these grants. And so it's tricky and it takes practice. And again, I think reading grants will give you a really, really good sense of this, right? Seeing how like other scholars are able to do this. I think a grant will not be a summary of everything you're thinking about. That being said, they tend to be intellectually complex documents, right? They're in simple language. And if a theoretical, like if some sort of academic lingo is crucial, like you absolutely cannot say it any other way, then you have to explain what you mean by it in the grant, right? But something that's just jargon, like, no, like, it's going to get passed over.
I would just add to what Hosna said. Look, I mean, what is theory for, right? Theory is a scaffolding. Okay, if you're a political theorist, I understand that theory is the heart of what you do. But for most of the rest of us, theory is scaffolding. So one way I would say one thing to keep in mind is this how you would teach your topic to first-year undergraduate class, right? Do you walk into an undergraduate class and say, the theoretical concepts, and now I've lectured you, right? You wouldn't. You would take the theory, you would break it down into its segments, right? And then you would teach, if you're a good teacher, which I'm sure all of you are, you would teach through the examples that those bits of the theoretical concept give you. I theorize experience, or even when I'm speaking to my students, I don't use according to X theorist and Y theorist, that because that is also a way in which we basically hedge our bets. You don't want to hedge your bets in a classroom. You don't want to hedge your bets in a fellowship application, right? You want to say, this is what I do. So say, this is what I do. The theoretical concept, you actually, if you know your subject inside out, you don't really need it. You will need it to speak to your peers in your own disciplines to show that you know the discipline. But that's, as Hosna beautifully put it, this is not what an grant application is. It's a complex intellectual piece of writing that actually is directed at smart people who don't care whether you know this theoretical concept or not. So keep it out, but break it into pieces and use the examples that it gives you.
Fantastic advice. I'll definitely personally take that into consideration. Dr. Morgana, did you have something to add on? Oh, wait, you're muted, sorry.
Right. I just would love to add one little point to what Hosna and Naghmeh just said by giving a couple of examples from, for example, a postdoctoral fellowship from the Marie Curie application. As Naghmeh was saying, no one will ask you to be precise and to just speculate on theory, on application, when you have a really limited work count. So the excellence part, for example, is tailored and specifically designed on assessing the quality and pertinence of the projects. For example, the innovation objectives or the soundness of the proposed methodology. But then everything has to be connected and to be concise, precise, direct. And I wouldn't say that theoretical speculation belongs actually to a kind of these kind of grant applications. Yeah, just wanted to give this little examples.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So we have a PhD student from one of the Iranian universities in the field of literature, Persian literature, and they're asking whether or how they can sort of propose a project with other professors or other institutions to sort of get this lift off. Sorry, I'm translating. So yeah, they're looking to sort of do a cooperation in some sort.
Laya, do you want to also pick who you want to start and then we can pick up?
Oh yeah, sorry. Since you already unmuted, let's go with you.
This is what happens when you have a big mouth. No, so that's a very good question, and the answer is going to differ in terms of geography, right? So in the United States, the answer is pretty much almost impossible to do. Because of sanctions, because of money, because of visas. So in terms of the practicality of it, it's close to impossible to do. But whether reaching out to someone in the United States or reaching out to someone in Europe, so I think all of us who are professors in the US receive emails from our colleagues in Iran. I think I get maybe 10 a day, right? And I feel limited by the fact that I cannot help. I feel limited by the fact that I cannot reach out. But there's also a limitation in terms of how this interaction happens, right? So in terms of a general advice, know your audience, right? So I work on 19th and 20th century Iran. I get requests for hamkari and musharakat from people who work on they work on things that has nothing to do with what I am doing. And it gives the impression to the person who's receiving the email that the person is not interested in working with them, but is interested in working with someone outside the US, which is completely understandable, but it is also not helping the person's cause. So in reaching out, I would say read a bit of what the people are doing, think about your own project, and think about how they can help you out, but also what knowledge you're bringing to the table, right? That can actually work in terms of a real hamkari, a real musharakat. Because the will, I will tell you this much, the will for those of us outside of Iran to work with people inside of Iran is extremely there. We want it, we're open to it if we can. So the issue is not the will. The issue is sometimes, a lot of times, the type of formulation of the projects don't fit, right? So if your project doesn't have a lot of analysis, but it has a lot of data and empirical stuff, it's not going to work for a lot of the fellowships and grants that, for example, we're applying for it. And so the question becomes how to work together to find an analytical framework that works for both, right? And a lot of times, as I mentioned, the topics just don't work together. So I would say be very careful, be specific, do a lot of research, and start the conversation by, I have this idea, I've seen your work, I know what your work is about, X, Y, and Z. My work is about these topics that are related to it. Can we set up a conversation and talk about it? And start with that conversation, as opposed to starting with I would like to do this research project with you. Will you find money? Will you find grants? Which is what a lot of the emails actually start with.
That is excellent advice. I'm going to wrap the sort of last two questions in one, and that is basically, what are the topics that the European and American researchers are looking for in the Iranian studies? And the sort of related question would be, should you cater to those? Like, should you that? And I guess Dr. Morgana, because this is more towards the students who might want to apply to European universities, would you want to take that?
Yeah, thank you, Alaya. I wish I had the right answer to that, because I think I'm still too junior and young to be in those important rooms where decisions are made. But what I can say is that anything digital, for example, making a good connection between the digital world and including gender is very much appealing to European institutions at the moment. I would say that these are the two main topics that you may want to consider to include. But yeah, it's really hard to know, because most of the small fellowships, such as the one I mentioned in the beginning from the International Institute of Social History, for example, they are very useful for Iranian scholars, because they last just 6 months, so that they can get familiar with the system. I think that's the main point that Naghmeh and Hosna already touched upon. Most of the times, the main problem is not the topic in itself, but the way it is articulated. So it's unfortunate to say, but we all need to practice, right? And I think this is just there is a strategy, and we can get through.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to sort of wrap it up. I really appreciate the time of each and every one of you. I personally have plenty more questions to sort of ask, and I think maybe it might do us good to sort of have another set of series talking about fellowships, on a next panel or something. Any final thoughts or no?
I just wanted to say, I think we missed a question, and I just wanted to be really
Oh,
hold on. I'm so sorry. Yeah. I just wanted to say something really quickly, because I think we missed one of the questions, and I want to be very clear. They asked if it's better to have research ideas first or write a research proposal based on the applications. Of course, you can be inspired by other people's projects, but I really mean in terms of the form, right? Like, how did they articulate their research question? How much time did they devote to the lit review? Like, was it 1 paragraph? Was it 2 sentences, right? Copy the model, but your ideas in your research, right? Hopefully you have thought a lot about that, what's particular and personal to you, and maybe comes out of the studies you've been doing. So it's not that you're copying up people's sort of projects, right? But just their language and their formulation within a grant application.
Thank you.
Can I just add something to what Hosna said, which is picking up on what actually Stella and then Hosna said. It's look, grant applications are a weird animal in that you simultaneously have to show you know a lot, and then show that without this funding, you can't answer your question, right? So this, going back to this last question, if you write a great let's suppose there's a grant application on digital humanities. You've never worked on digital humanities. And then you decide to use all the tips that you got to write something. It's going to show, it's going to show that it's, but at the same time, if you have done a little bit of research or a lot of research and have done all the things that Hosna and Stella and I said, primarily draft, redraft, have other people look at models, think about the suitability, you can actually find a way to put in your application that, without this grant, I actually can't fully answer the question that I am asking now, right? And that becomes actually, and it's a genuine moment, not a fake moment, right? Like, oh, if you don't give me the grant, I can't do this. That's not what I'm talking about. But just that fine line of saying, you show your thinking, you show the research you've done, but you can't actually say, I came to this question because of X, Y, and Z. And with this fellowship application, I can actually expand on the question. Right now, without this fellowship, I have not been able to reach, which is something that I used in a fellowship application that was successful. So find that perfect sweet spot between showing, but also having the humility to say, these questions, I'm still thinking about them, and I need help from you to give me money to be able to answer them.
Well, great. Thank you so much. A list is posted on the chat right now, but we're hoping to sort of populate that and make a better list and put it on the presidential session link or webpage. There's a question about the following upcoming presidential session. We'll sort of keep you posted as we go. Thank you all. Thank you for the participants. Thank you for the panelists.
Thank you.
And this was great.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. We'll be having this video on YouTube very soon. Thank you again to all our panelists. Sorry we couldn't get to, there's another question, but another session. Bye-bye.